If I may, Dr. Abla, just mention two comments before I ask Ms. Simon my question, because in Dr. Aouni's words, you mentioned Carnegie Foundation, which is a very important one. I would like just you to know that I benefited from this foundation. I lived where the Carnegies were living in Pittsburgh, and I went to the Carnegie Mellon when it was an institute, not a university like now, and the Carnegie Library. So we benefited really from that. So just, and when you mentioned the Quakers, they are also in Pennsylvania, and for centuries, I went with my family, with my children, and visited them and stayed one day with them, and I was fascinated with what they are doing. Now I come to my question. I'm not an economist, so allow my ignorance if I just feel that you changed with your informative speech, really, the meaning of the word impact in my mind, from a word to a concept, a multidimensional one. And I would like to highlight the ethical impact of the investment. It includes most of what you've been saying, but it is ethical in nature. So it is very important to highlight it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So a couple comments there, and I appreciate your comments about Carnegie, because philanthropy, it's important to note, philanthropy has done a lot of good too and continues to do a lot of good. So it's not saying, and this goes back to Anand Giridharadas' line of, as opposed to just focusing on giving back, stop taking, right? So how can we make sure, yes, if we amass wealth, it's great to give back, and as we amass wealth, or ideally even distribute wealth more equally, right, in the first place, can we be more thoughtful about how we're doing it? But I think it's interesting that we can certainly benefit from philanthropy as we can have critiques, and I think that that's always critical in any kind of healthy society, right? The ability to be engaged in this dialogue of whether it's government or philanthropy or otherwise or corporations. We do lots of good, and there's still things that we can improve, right? So we can still have that gratitude. And it's very funny, right? The fact that the book that I love, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that's about critiquing foundations, was funded by a foundation, right? And it was in part because Ford as a foundation and in its evolution is thinking critically about the role of philanthropy, right? And that's the importance of these centers as well, right? In terms of the work that you're doing to say, as philanthropy is growing, let's be really thoughtful, right, about how we can get that right. So it's wonderful that Egypt has these institutions that are able to really lead that mantle and do such good research. So I would say being an active part of that conversation is really critical to celebrate all of the wonderful work that philanthropy can do and push it to do better, right, in the same way that we do in all of our relationships. And then second, that moral piece, thank you for bringing up that word, because I think it's important to return to, even putting impact aside, when we think about why do we do investing, right? Financial investing. We do financial investing to generate more resources, to create more money for ourselves, for our institutions. Well, why do we do that, right? Why do we want more money on a basic level? I think most people, if you say, would you rather have less money or more money, they would choose the more money option, right? But it's usually because we're trying to create a purpose. Money is a representation of value. So when I think about investing, I'm thinking about sitting down with my grandkids and being able to say, choose any university you want. I got it. I made sure that our family has enough resources that you can choose any college that you want. You're never going to have to worry about being hungry. You're never going to have to worry about being homeless. But I want to make sure that I don't have to say to that grandchild, I made this possibility for you by stealing from someone else's family. Someone else's family is poor so that you could be wealthy. That's not a good feeling of legacy, right? When we really think about having a holistic legacy in society, and that's what a lot of these original philanthropists were trying to do, to say, I want to make sure that I'm a positive contributing member. So that means I want to be really concrete about what my investments are doing in the world. And that this applies not just going back to this idea of distribution of philanthropists, not just to those who have significant financial resources, but to all of us. So to give one more example, I've done a lot of work on the question of private prisons in the U.S., which is a strangely U.S. phenomena, U.S. and U.K., but few places in the world that depend on private prisons. Have people been seeing in the past year the images of children being locked up on the U.S. border? It's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing that that's happening at all. But additionally, what you may not know is that 74% of those immigrants who have been locked up are in privately run facilities that make up to $750 a night. All right, so they might as well stay at the Ritz-Carlton. But instead, it's our tax dollars, right, that are paying these private prisons to house these immigrants. And it turns out the way that these private prisons run is that they get financing from JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Barclays, right, all the major banks that you could name. And it meant that even if you only had $100 in the bank, your money could be financing that, right? So going back to my example, I never want to tell my grandkids, I supported your future by locking up someone else's child. That's a terrible way to have your legacy defined. But most of us, sorry about that, when you put your money in the bank, you don't know where your money spends the night. Or if you have a financial advisor, right? That sometimes we just turn the money over, we see the quarterly reports, we know what the returns are, but we don't actually know where the money is. And that means that it could be doing things like locking children in cages. I know that sounds like extremist language, but in the US, that is true, right? That is actually happening right now. And I think that's the sort of thing we have to really think about. Where is our money spending the night, whether you have $100 or $100 million, because otherwise we are all losing the opportunity to create the type of legacy that we really want for ourselves and our families.
Very important question. Where is our money spending the night? Think about it. Oh, I'm serious. تجين الموضوع.
Well, I have more of a technical question, actually. My question is, how do you ensure these impact investing programs or projects are not short-sighted or short-term? How do you ensure that?
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sorry, Khadija Al-Rapti from Al Ahram newspaper.
So I would go back to those 3 transform finance principles, right? So if communities are engaged in design, governance, and ownership, so that community feedback is not just at the beginning, but is throughout the process, and that community members actually have the ability to change things about how things are done, right? Then you make sure that it's going to continue to have that long-term benefit. Principle 2, if it's structured in a way that's non-extractive, right? So even thinking back to that cacao example, rather than having to worry, is the fair trade standard enough, or are they getting enough money? If I know that the majority of the value of every transaction is going to farmers, I don't have to worry about it, right? I can set the structure and let it run and know that as the company scales, the impact is going to scale right alongside it. So that's another critical component and a critical difference between, I don't think we got enough into the distinction of CSR versus impact investing. So corporate social responsibility, right, is the idea that the way that you run your operations can have that social and environmental impact, but that the ultimate product might be great for society or might not be beneficial for society. Whereas if in the context of impact investment, every dollar that I make is tied to a unit of social change, right? That I'm able to empower one more farmer or take one more ton of carbon out of the atmosphere, then I know that they're going to have that kind of positive alliance through the lifetime, as opposed to saying, I paid my workers well through a CSR program, but I destroyed the environment. Or, that you can do good in one area through CSR without really addressing the core business functions. And that's some of, we mentioned the difference between the how and the what. That CSR could be the how, but you got to make sure you get the what correct as well, right? So both of those elements. So that's another major factor. And then finally, balancing the risk and return between investors, entrepreneurs, and communities. Are you structuring it in such a way to make sure that you're creating value for communities in the long run? And the third, I could keep going. I mean, the point is basically that it's not guaranteed, right? That we absolutely have to be vigilant, that we have to be conscious consumers. And in the same way, when you go to the market, right, of the example that we often give, though I'm not sure, I'm trying to make sure I get my metaphors in a way that's useful. When you pick up a piece of produce in the market, do you know if it's been sprayed with pesticides? Do you know how the workers were paid? Do you know if it's something that's going to actually be healthy for you and your children? Or what sort of questions do you have to ask, right, before you know if this is good for you? So we often talk about the conscious consumer movement, that people care a lot more about what they're putting into their bodies and for their families. And in that same way, we have to be conscious consumers of investments. We can't just say, oh, like oftentimes on food, you'll see a label all natural. What does all natural mean? Absolutely nothing, right? That it's just marketing. And in that same way, we have to be careful that if something says its impact doesn't necessarily mean its impact. Just because something's microfinance or energy or agriculture may or may not have a positive impact depending on how it's being done.
Thank you so much.
Very interesting. I think the community-driven projects and cooperatives would help a lot with achieving impact investment. But the scaling, again, is a challenge, and the role of government is a big challenge as well. Any other comments, please?
Thank you, Morgan. Your presentation was excellent. My name is Lula Zaklama. My profession is designing communication strategies. One of the main problems that we are facing here, and I'm sure elsewhere, is defining a clear difference between philanthropy and CSR. They are two different industries, two different objectives and everything. I'm still struggling with that. I've been struggling with it for many years, and I would like to have your comment. How can we just even though I'm an expert in communication, I still have not been able to communicate the difference between philanthropy and CSR. Thank you.
So maybe my first question back is who you're trying to communicate to.
Stakeholders. I'm talking to the stakeholders. I'm talking to the government. I'm talking to my stakeholders. I'm talking to the community and to my workers in my company.
Great, that's helpful. So I think my starting place would be for whose benefit? And that CSR, most of the time, the benefit is actually for the corporation, right? And that even sometimes, so I really appreciate the question in that it's important to acknowledge sometimes giving away money can be for the purpose of the corporation, right? That whether they're trying to get ingratiated with a particular community for a particular purpose, that there is that back of the mind intention of how is this ultimately going to benefit me? And that, I think from a corporate strategy perspective, is not necessarily a negative, right? Because you kind of have, depending on the competitive dynamics on the market, you can absolutely take advantage of the consumer, right? And you don't have to necessarily do CSR. That the other opportunity is to have a very short-sighted approach of essentially defrauding the consumer, right? And the idea that if you, through CSR, are trying to create better conditions. So for instance, there's been great research done that workers that are paid living wages and that are better treated, not only steal less from companies, they collude less with each other to steal. And that's the type of thing. And then also turnover, right, of like how much it costs to retrain workers every time someone leaves. So you might look at an initiative like paying a living wage, right, and think of, oh, that's for the benefit of the employee. It's absolutely for the benefit of the company as well. If you have alignment in those things, that's fantastic, right? Like definitely do those things. But I think ideally with philanthropy, there's times where there's things that may not have benefit for you or your company, but you do it because it's the right thing. And it was interesting, Dr. Ohani, when he was saying before that the root of philanthropy was with the robber barons, I actually would go back way further, and that in terms of the texts, people like Prophet Muhammad, people like Jesus, right, who were known for being philanthropists essentially in their community, right, of how do you take care of others and share your resources, that it's been individual people as opposed to perhaps institutional philanthropy, right? But the idea of selflessness is really part of kind of a human development sort of concept that we should care for others and that we should give selflessly, or people talk about in the kind of continuum of what is the most pure form of philanthropy. Does anyone know what people tend to put at the top of that pyramid? It's that which is anonymous, right? So imagine a corporation doing anonymous philanthropy. They're like, no, I want credit, right? I want my name on the side of that building. So that's a huge piece of it when we go to whose benefit is it for. And if it's truly, so for instance, one of the families that I work with in the US that's a billionaire asset owner, they have created a pool that's actually in the hundreds of millions of dollars, where the concept is to be communities deciding where the money goes. So rather than the wealthy families saying, they're saying, we want to turn over this to community control, and they're going to make the decisions. So from that perspective, in that CSR to philanthropy continuum, it's saying this is absolutely selfless because we're going to get out of the way entirely. So I would kind of go to those two elements of like, who is this supposed to be benefiting? What are your motivations in doing it? If it is to gain more audience or to capture efficiencies or have happier workers, you can still do it. That's still great. But let's be honest about what the motivations are in each instance. And then also recognizing that, going back to that 12% being funded by social justice, philanthropy may at times be funding people who may organize against you, right? So sometimes the supporting of things like labor unions, and recognizing that any fight, you want to have a good opponent, right? That you don't want to be in the boxing ring and the guy's just standing on the ropes. So how do you make sure that civil society has the tools that they need? So that's where, and I'm sorry, this is a long answer. We often think about CSR is great for shifting corporate practice as it is, and philanthropy is great for funding the types of organizing that's going to change the system, that's going to have that sort of innovative thinking, that's going to protect human rights, that's going to be kind of really pushing the potential of society in a much more concrete way.
I love that. Can I just interrupt one thing? No, it's okay. It's fine.
Now I'm so
I was just talking about the definitions. CSR is often defined here as reputation management. Mm-hmm. Is that correct or wrong? Or is it a continuation of CSR? Or is that a product of CSR, reputation management?
If it's done well, I think it's a product. Because I think the only, to be a little bit less cynical, perhaps, and some of the companies that I admire, like Unilever, right, where they have made it actually a key driver of growth and profitability, right? And this goes back to saying, okay, if you're the oil company with only 8 years of reserves, maybe expanding into renewables is a great business strategy in addition to being a good corporate citizen, right? That you can do those two things at the same time. And you may make decisions, right, that are about your reputation, but ideally it's because you're seeing that confluence of social and environmental companies outperforming, right? This is even just as a financial strategy, and that CSR is a vehicle to do it.
I'll speak in Arabic.
مصباح قطب from المصري اليوم newspapers. I think that the wave of the CSR started exactly when as we heard 2 years ago in Panama, the refugees and the tax evasion, like in the USA and in the UK, it was like a kind of conflict concerning the taxes evasion and exemption. So concerning this, we were surprised 20 years ago that all the cooperation, that they love environment, that they love workers, that they love consumers, and they are very ideal, and they are talking about ethics and how they love each other and how they love to comfort their workers. So what you said, that is, for me, is a kind of indicator that this wave is about to end, and we are going to start a new wave to depend on ourselves and to depend on our own resources. And this for sure will exempt the responsibilities on the countries. The other point, I don't see any conflict between what you said and between the global trend concerning the entrepreneurships. The same words, job opportunities, initiatives, putting in consideration creativity and innovation and focusing on the society, the same idea, but nobody is asking himself who is focusing on the impact investments, why we have such social problems, why we have such environmental problems, why we do have the climate changes problems and challenges. So I think that, or my impression that I think it is just like a wave. I really appreciate what you said. But for us, we are inspired, either we like it or not. My last point, that is after the countries, after they finish with this problems, with the taxes problems, I think that the companies and the corporations will stop talking about the CSR, will stop talking about the social responsibilities, because their problems will be solved.
So, a couple thoughts in response. Thank you for that. Your first point around CSR and the wave, and where I think the wave can go, we often as impact investors, and particularly investing across all asset classes, right, that we're doing public investments in very large traditional companies, but then also building the next generation of companies that are doing more sustainable work, that are more community minded, that we need that balance. We need the CSR and the ESG to change the way that major corporations run, because major corporations have a lot to offer the economy, right? That they already run so much of activity. So for instance, the ability of utilities and fossil fuel companies, for instance, that have huge drills, huge infrastructure, can move to geothermal, right? Can repurpose some of their equipment and their management teams to do more socially responsible business, is a wonderful thing. And we can use our influence in publicly owned companies to do that. And at the same time, we use tools like angel investing, like venture capital, and private equity too, to grow the future that we want to see, to invest in the next generation of companies that say, we're not just going to have CSR as an add-on, but absolutely integral to everything that we do. But we can't, in the meantime, just support those businesses and turn our back on the existing business infrastructure that exists. We will fail, right? Because it's too big. It's too much of the economy. Or a company like Walmart, right, where it's the largest employer in most states in the U.S. We can't just invest in businesses that pay living wages. We have to pressure Walmart to pay living wages too. So I think it's a balance of tactics, and really being activist investors in that way is a critical component to it. And the second, I think your point that going back to that interaction between government and businesses, that neither sector can solve it all, right? So you're not going to have the end of government intervention or of social businesses, because one side or the other can solve all the problems. But we can have a more thoughtful approach to how the two sides are working together. So for instance, earlier, Dr. Ali was mentioning like investments in innovation, right? Or the US government paying for most of the founding of the internet, That was a good one, right, in terms of global value created. So you're going to continue to have that ping-ponging of innovation from the public to the private sector, and making sure that each one is playing the appropriate role hopefully advances the ability of both over time.
Dr. Amira Hottub.
Thank you, Dr. Abla, for the invitation. My name is Amira Hottub, and I'm very sorry I missed the first part of your very precious intervention. I came from the other town, other side of town. I am actually grateful to Mr. Misbah Hottub, and I'm happy to speak after him because I can share many of the points he mentioned. I actually benefited a lot from CSR. And I can associate with what Dr. Aouni said. I think it's all relative, how you look at it. But the starting point of any investor is, if I'm an investor, I look after my best interest. I mean, why do I invest? I invest because I want to get a benefit. Now the situation has changed because the stakeholders, Madam Lula talked about, are more aware of their rights. And stakeholders are so many, so many. It depends how they see their rights. It depends on their strength. And now with the media and everything. And for the investor, the most important thing is to engage, like you said, with the community, engage with all stakeholders and reach a comfortable consensus that will guarantee the security and the sustainability of peace between all stakeholders. It depends very much on the government and the law, whether the government makes it a condition for the investor to engage with all stakeholders or not. Dr. Abla gave a very important example, Heliopolis and the changes that are happening in Heliopolis and the community complaining. But of course, heck with it. I mean, everything is happening and it's really not. And also it depends on how you present what's right and what's not right. Because everything we've been talking about now is relative. Nothing is really clear-cut, whether it's good for you or not. I mean, we worked with Danone to build a reception place for abused victims of trafficking. If you're going to see what's right or wrong in this, it's endless, really. So I think it depends on the law, the regulator, which is theoretically the state, and how you can really make sure that the rights and interests of all stakeholders at least have reached a comfortable common denominator that will ensure peace for the investment, for the investor. And then when we reach this point, we can say whether it's positive or negative. Maybe I don't make sense, but what I want to say is that really in the world of today, everything is murky. And it depends how well you present your case, how well you prove that this is right. It may not be right, but if you have the resources to prove it's right, okay. How you sell it. How you sell it, bravo. And yes, yes, communication. And then investing in the infrastructure. The infrastructure can be hard and it can be soft because during times of recessions, countries that invested in education did much better than countries that built roads. But you need to educate the decision maker. Thank you.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to the last words. You want to say respond to the last words?
Not for a lifetime. Yeah, exactly. You can't shut me up. No, in that sense. So I think two kind of critical things in response. So one is at a certain point you have to decide whose opinion to prioritize. And recognizing that people don't always have the same resources. They don't all have the communications experts right on their team. So how do you make sure that those community responses get to be as robust and as listened to? And that sometimes can mean as the investor that you have to be okay with giving up power. Because otherwise we automatically have the upper hand, right? And we have to walk into the room knowing that. And shift sometimes people say like step up, step back, of when do I have to step back to create more space for others. And that might be, for instance, that goes back to funding organizing, right? So that people can independently get to decide how they can be the most formidable person at the negotiating table with you. And then also, as you were saying, the idea that the investor is trying to get a benefit, thinking more holistically about the legacy that's being created, right? And is it just that I did the minimum for people, or that I really was a contributing member to society as I supported both my family and others? And I think the final kind of lesson that actually was a very early one for my career, even before the can of tuna. I grew up in Los Angeles, very middle-class family, and Los Angeles is a very diverse city. It's, I think at this point, majority Latino, right? We have many immigrants from Mexico and Central America, and that often are working the hardest, longest, worst-paying jobs. And I spent a lot of time, I started running tutoring programs when I was a teenager. So did a lot of work in largely Mexican communities and spent a lot of time in people's homes. And was seeing so often, whether a family of 6 crowded into one bedroom, the mom getting abused at work because she's undocumented, right, that she doesn't have the legal rights, so then people can just pay whatever they want, treat people however they want, kids not getting access to quality education. And I think often the response that people have and the idea of charity can sometimes be this othering of, oh, those poor people, the things that happen to those people, as opposed to the idea of solidarity, which is, what if I treat everyone like my family? And for me, I think particularly because I was young and impressionable, that these kids that I was tutoring felt like my little siblings. And I took it personally. I was really hurt to see the conditions that they and their families were going through. And I wasn't just hurt, I was angry, right? In the same way that if you saw your little sister going to bed without food or your mom getting mistreated at work, right, you would do anything to get them out of that situation. And I think the starting point when we think about multi-stakeholder engagement, can I treat these people I don't know like my family, right? Like, can I really lean into that idea of empathy to make it more concrete of, I want anyone, sorry? Absolutely, absolutely. And to feel like, whether it's the wages that I would pay or the conditions that I would create or how I would structure a deal, if it was my daughter on the other side of the negotiating table, what would I want for them? And how do I treat everyone in society like they're my family? That's a sentiment that I try to bring into anything that I'm negotiating, right? So it's not just the what is minimally acceptable for people who have spent generations and generations having to accept less, because they're in a society and in a construct that situates them with less, right? So focusing not just on making it slightly less miserable to be poor, but how do we all move forward together, being a major objective and a major outcome that I think we can have with impact investing. So I think that's where I would leave it, of really saying, one, try to have that empathy in your relations. Two, really looking at all your financial connections, right? Kind of a money audit, we sometimes say, of whether it's your money in the bank, whether it's the alma mater of your university, whether you're part of a pension fund or you run a corporation. What are the different pools and communities that you're a part of that you have influence over, and can start to ask that question, where is my money spending the night, right? Is it doing things in the world that I would be proud of, and is it generating the legacy that I want? And if not, how do I find the resources, right? Whether it's doing impact investing, whether it's doing CSR, whether it's engaging in these different ways, to be able to create that more holistic legacy that you're looking for. And if questions come up, please do feel free to email me. I'm very accessible and happy to keep in touch.
Thank
you. I just want to comment on the CSR part. I'll give you, I mean, there are many examples of corporations that started with a mandate that has a very social side to it. I'll give you an example. Hershey chocolate, for example, in the US. You go to Pennsylvania, I mean, the whole city is built around a chocolate factory, and one of the mandate is people there living in a reasonable living situation. Cadbury actually started in a similar way, by the way. When you look at CSR, it depends where it is under the structure of the organization. If it is under marketing, if it is under external relation, if you find like a middle-aged manager who has a certain fund you can play with, you can tell right away this is a marketing. Now look, I give you some examples of companies that are doing fantastic quote-unquote CSR. CSR in my view is engaging with the community. I don't care how you label it. Essilor, for example, they make eyeglasses. Essilor, their CSR is about delivering cheap eyeglasses to the poor. Now they have a foundation, and the people in charge of all this whole thing, their boss is called a chief mission officer. A chief mission officer reports to the CEO. This is another one example. Another interesting example is Danone. I mean, Danone, yes, they have a CSR, but they do a marvelous inclusive business. They try to include small players into their value chain. Now, what do they call the people in charge of this? They call them ecosystem managers. This is about building an ecosystem. Now, Ford Foundation, Ford, by the way, Ford is the first one who talks about a limited period of time. In the beginning, it used to be 12 hours, just complete slavery. 12 hours, no weekends whatsoever. Ford said, well, hey, if I give them an 8-hour and I give them a weekend, first he gets a better productivity, but he was looking at his employees as a potential customers. He says if they get paid better, if they have a weekend, they can afford to buy cars. This was his rationale. Now, I'm going to switch in Arabic. Boss of Masr.
Look at what happened in Egypt and look at Talat Harb, who established Bank Misr because he was convinced that the money was British and it was serving the best interest of communism. That's why he established Bank Misr in order to protect the national aspirations. One of the things that Bank Masr established was al-mahalla weaving and ginning, and established a sports system. He was building an ecosystem. So Talat Harb understood the name of the game at that time. And now I heard some of you ladies talking about I'm digressing from CSR.
Governance is really critical. Governance, part of it is the law of law, زي ما حضرتك قلتي. لكن law is always lagging behind.
Why would we have any balance? Especially I'm speaking about the grassroots and whole communities. I could force equality in the ecosystem, and this is very hard work. I'm going to stop here. سوف أتوقف هنا، ولكن الحكومات تعتبر غاية في الأهمية عندما نتحدث عن الموقع في مصر. هذا هو الأمر الذي كان ناقصا، الحكومات والحكومات المحلية وأيضا دور المجتمعات.
إيه؟ بالضبط. بالضبط. Thank you.
Speaking of last words, who do we need to listen to? Who do we must listen to? You ask that question. It's the people. It's the communities. It's very straightforward. I think your messages are key. Your messages are badly needed. it's badly needed that they are to be heard by governments, because governments actually are more problematic than the private sector. Private sector, when they go for impact, they go by choice. But the governments, it is their duty. So when governments go into investments and do not cause impact, who do not engage the communities, this is a disaster, okay? And there are serious priorities in developing countries. We have our own issues. You mentioned at the beginning the revolution. You said when I talk about the revolution, I'm not talking about your revolution. It's nice to talk about our revolution. It was asking for social justice and for good things. I know, sorry. Yeah, we're having campaigns. No, I'm not. Not. أنا مع ربنا. We have a series of campaigns for treating people from disease. Okay, virus C, kidney problems. All right, but 80% of our villages do not have sewage system. If you took care of that, people are going to be way less sick. So we have our issues. But thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. We have to thank the tuna can for taking you in the wrong, taking you off the wrong road of development into something that's a lot more serious.
And
Thank
we
you very
also
much.
have to, I'm sorry she couldn't be here today because she was sick, but Noha, I don't want to mispronounce her last name, El Makawi?
Makawi, yeah.
From the Ford Foundation, who had read the book and reached out and invited me to come to Egypt. So it's thanks to her.
She's a friend, actually.
kindness,
Yeah,
that I'm here.
Very thankful. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll see how we